Yeah.
Amazing. Hello, everyone. As I said before, we are recording this call. We'll edit it up and get it posted later. Feel free to put video on or off, your choice. Questions along the way, and pretty open. I've asked Bryan from Bluesky to basically talk about um, their DID method, their placeholder DID method of PLC, how that kind of works today, and where that is heading in terms of other people connecting into it. And Brian, like, feel free to go like, that's a good question. Like, let's cover that later, if it doesn't make sense. And otherwise, take it away.
Cool. I'm going to do this. I'm doing this thing where I run my own video without sharing screen. So I hope that works for folks, but you might want to select my video and enlarge it because it won't pop up for you automatically.
There we go.
So I'm Bryan. I'm from Bluesky. I'm a protocol engineer. I've been working at the company for about a year. I work on standards stuff and some of our kind of like moderation tooling and things like that. Most of what I'm presenting here are kind of like ideas that fermented before I started at Bluesky. So these aren't things I designed or came up with myself. Dan, who's in the call, was pretty central to designing PLC, but I've been around for the ride of kind of getting these a little more standardized and watching them play out. So what we're going to run over in this talk, Bluesky's built this. I'm not going to get a ton into Bluesky. I kind of assume people are a little on that page. It's a social media company with an app, and we've built both this network and product, and we're fully committed to running it as a product and a network. But we've also at the same time built a protocol that we built our application on top of, and we would like other people to build other applications at the same time. So we are a kind of two-spirit company. We're both doing this kind of R&D protocol development thing, and we're running a live real network with real people that we really care about and will continue to care about in the future. So we built a identity system for Bluesky and for AppProto that has a couple different components. One of those is this did PLC method. So I'm going to give a little bit of just kind of like the backstory and how the identity system works overall and where PLC fits into that. A little bit of context about like how this is all working out in production. Like, how is it working? We're about to hit about 5 million people in the network. Like, how much does this cost? Like, what's gone wrong? What hasn't gone wrong? And then some ideas that we've had. So no announcement of exactly what we're doing, but we have a bunch of different small ideas and how they might compose together to improve kind of the governance and credibility of PLC specifically as a service for other people to build on. And then a couple brief notes about just like other things that might help other people adopt both PLC as a specific component of the identity system or our overall identity system, and kind of an invitation for other people to say like, here's why I'm not using it. Here's what's wrong. Here's why I wouldn't trust you. Or also like, here's what's missing. Here's why I'm going to wait until you do this, kind of a thing. So the big picture, we have a couple of values. So the team did more than a year of kind of research and comparing other stuff out there. We didn't just jump in and get going. A lot of this was before I started. So we kind of like defined a couple. We started with social goals and these kind of political economic goals almost of how we want power in the Bluesky network and the protocol to work, and then kind of considered lots of options, considered blockchains, considered peer-to-peer things, considered completely offline device-centric networking, things like that. And we came up with a couple like, okay, what do we really care about? What are the core properties we really want in the protocol and in our identity system? And so some of the things we identified is like, the core technology has to be completely open and identified. We'd like to move it into a standards body eventually for the long-term governance. But to start, our development philosophy is to develop the protocol and the product with a single exemplar product at the same time, as opposed to doing a standards process first and then trying to build an application on top of it. One of the properties we really care about is credible exit, to let people change their service provider for any individual component in the stack of the protocol. We think that's a quite important property. As much as possible, we want people to kind of like own their own. This is like a almost like a throwback term, but like own your identity and own your data. I think we're kind of delivering on that, which is kind of amazing, because I got kind of super cynical about this terminology in the past. But giving people kind of control over their own content, that comes through as trying to design protocols that are self-certifying pretty often. So the data itself is, it's not which authority you're getting it from. You can redistribute content and stuff like that. And sort of related to our identity system as well, we want to build a foundation for other apps to be built on top of. We're not trying to build something just for Bluesky. We'd like other people to be able to build on top of what we're doing going forward, and put a fair amount of effort into that. So the team looked around, and one of the core components we decided to build on top of was basically to have two aspects of identity. So there's a long-term persistent identifier, which we chose to use DIDs, decentralized identifiers, which is a W3C standard. DIDs are a little, if you're not familiar with them, they're a little kind of like a meta standard. It's more of an abstract interface for what an identity system could be. It doesn't define how the identity system works. It basically says anything that lets you take a DID, which is like a little URI, and resolve it to a JSON document that looks like this JSON document, that's a DID method. There's some other stuff you could do, like you could support updates to the DID document. You can support tombstoning or deletion of the identity, but those are a little bit optional in the spec. And so the DID standard doesn't say how you're supposed to go about this. People have come up with dozens of different methods. A lot of them are built on blockchains and cryptocurrencies and stuff like that, but there's also simple ones that just use web servers, like DID web, which is the identifier is basically just a host name, and you can resolve it there. Anyways, we wanted to do something somewhat flexible. There's not a lot of overhead to DID, so we went with DIDs, but we invented our own DID method, DID PLC, which I'll get into the details of a little bit. But the important thing to know is basically you have this identifier, a DID PLC, and what you can do with it is resolve and get back this DID document. And the core kind of components, there's a section with also known as, and this lets you put URIs that are kind of like handles or usernames or other information, kind of like see also here, maybe your website, other stuff can go there. You can put a series of keys, which are called verification methods. So these are public, cryptographic public keys, and they get a little tag, an ID, each one. So we can say, this is the key that you should use for @proto, but you could put other keys in this array. And then you can put service endpoint URL. And that also has a little bit of a tag and kind of a type metadata. So you can say, this is the one I want to use for @proto. This is my @proto PDS. You could also put, maybe you could put like, oh, I use Matrix and here's my Matrix server. I use these other things. You could put other stuff in there, but it's pretty simple, the DID document. The other component of this that we use, so the DID sticks around forever in the life cycle of an identity in @proto. Your DID never changes. It's encoded in all of these records. We don't have a migration path to like change your DID. That wouldn't quite make sense. Like you're really closely tied to it, and they're not very human meaningful. It's this DID PLC, hash. People aren't going to remember that. They're certainly not going to remember it to type it into a login field. They're not going to recognize them, things like that. They're not super human oriented. So we also have these more human oriented identifiers. And what we came up with that is handles. And we didn't want to manage ourselves a namespace, so we just borrowed the global DNS namespace. And so a @proto or a handle in this identity scheme is any host name. And there's a couple different ways to resolve, and you have to interlink. You have to reference the handle from your DID doc, and then you have to be able to resolve the host name back to the DID, and that links them together. The handles can change all the time. Handles can become invalid if it breaks. It's a much more ephemeral, but they're much more memorizable. They're human meaningful, and they're pretty cheap. You can make them a subdomain, or you can make it a registered domain to balance the cost of it. The whole system's specified, so a little bit about how DID PLC works, and this is just a sketch. I'm not trying to convince anyone on how great the technology is or anything. Basically, you bootstrap by creating like a little version of the DID document. You put in all the metadata fields you care about, and then you hash, and you encode it in CBOR in binary, and you hash that, and that gives you your DID PLC identifier. You truncate that and encode the hash and put it in the identifier itself. part of what you put in addition to what shows up in the did document, you put a couple cryptographic signing keys in there, and you're allowed, you can control updates in the future using those signing keys, which we call rotation keys. And you create this kind of chain of operations. And this is all auditable. It's all self-certifying. If you have all of the operations, a third party can look at those operations and say like, this looks like a good set of operations. And there's some other complexities in there around, you can have multiple keys. And so you can delegate one of the keys or give them to another organization or service on your behalf, or maybe a friend or something like that. And then there's a little bit of conflict resolution logic. Like if one key signs an update and you didn't like that update, you can go find your like maximum power rotation key and override that other one, but only for a time window. I'm not going to get into all the details of that, but there's a little bit of complexity around having multiple keys and controlling the future of it. But some of the core things here are, this core design of PLC is self-certifying and it's auditable. Other people can look at it. You don't have to trust. All you need is to get this pile of all these operations together, and that's all you need to trust it. A missing piece is like, how do you get these operations? Like, where do they live? To some degree, that's kind of flexible, and we could change that over time. We could come up with different ways of gossiping them around in the ecosystem. But pragmatically, to start, they're just in a directory server that we run.
Let's pause there for a second, because we just speed ran a ton of stuff, which is amazing. Funny that you said like, oh yeah, there's a couple of DID methods. I think last I checked, there's like almost 300. I like what you called about as a meta standard, and I totally understand how people were also like annoyed that you made a new one. But at the same time, having worked with DIDs ourselves at Fission, we said we're just going to do did key and keep it super freaking simple and see what else emerges. How do you see the did landscape evolving? And this could be a huge side quest, but just a little bit.
I think it's interesting. I mean, it hasn't like completely eaten the world, right? They haven't like totally taken off. I think we missed maybe one or two pretty interesting did methods, or there were a couple other did methods that were being developed at the same time that we were doing did PLC. The most notable other one is did own your data, OID. It's actually pretty similar to PLC in design. And so that could still be a potential collaboration that we could do with the own your data people. They seem pretty value aligned and stuff like that. PLC is pretty simple, like it's just super pragmatic for us, so it's worked out well. We also support did web, which builds on top of the global DNS system and control over a single server. We wanted to have at least two methods, so we weren't totally locked into one, and give people some extra control. Probably the other most like credible or appealing one would be the Ethereum did method. So we've considered adding support for that as well. The downsides of a bunch of the cryptocurrency methods are there's a fair amount of latency to mint and create them and to update them. So the user experience isn't great when you're onboarding. If you have to wait for consensus to happen in a blockchain, even that's like 5 or 10 seconds from the standards of doing an onboarding flow, that's pretty frustrating. Or if you want to change your handle, changing your handle to something quirky and fun for a day and then changing it back is like a super social thing to do. Yeah. And like the idea of that costing money would be kind of frustrating. Not to throw shade on these projects, right? Like everyone's trying different things and they work for different use cases and different goals when you're setting out. Those are all great. I would say, I mean, the biggest picture, somewhat cynically, like there's hundreds of these. There's been like 1,000 flowers have bloomed. And like, I think many of these are not even active anymore. Like there's this huge expansion and this huge contraction. So I think there's like at least a dozen or two contenders. But yeah.
My take has always been is I think there will be 5. Do I know which 5? Do I have an opinion? Nope. But description as a meta standard is great. Does anyone else have questions while we're paused for a bit?
I'm going to touch on it. Oh, go ahead.
I like Are you considering potentially in the future adding like 1 or 2 more DID methods beyond web and PLC?
We've considered it. I think it's not like a couple people have asked for some particular ones. I think it's nice to have, 2 or 3 is nice to ensure that the protocol is kind of flexible and things don't rust shut. Like if we don't support other ones, it might become very difficult in the future to actually support more. On the other hand, right, the counterforce is like effectively everyone has to implement all the methods everywhere for them to be useful, at least from the resolution standpoint. And there's it's just like, okay, if it's really simple, so did web is great because it's pretty easy to add. It's well specified. It's clear what you do. There's no provider that's probably going to permanently go down. Like individual DIDs might not work out, but the global thing won't. But we're not trying to like super gatekeep it and make it like an unrealistically high bar to get over. But I don't see any other ones right now that are like that the win would really be worth it. But we're open to it. If people want to propose something, we'll definitely consider it. Yeah.
Awesome. Take it away, Bryan.
Cool. Okay. So a couple last notes on just like some key properties of how this composed identity system comes together. One is that did PLC is a totally generic, did method. Like there's nothing about did PLC that is specific to app proto. Other people can use it as a regular did if they want. What that means is you could create, you don't need to have an app proto account or PDS or a Bluesky account or anything like that to create PLCs. You'd have to write some code and talk to the API to do that, or use a system that doesn't do that, but it's not logged in. Also, you could have an app proto account that's also used for other things. Like you could add other keys or other service endpoints or other identifiers into your existing app proto one. So you can sign up with that Bluesky or app proto and start using your did for other things and even remove the app proto capabilities over time. You could sign up with something else and add app proto accounts to that did over time, or you could just have a bunch of dids for different purposes. They're pretty unbundled. I went over what the kind of core metadata fields are already. Those are just the ones. There's a couple other potential fields in the did standard that we don't fully, I think we just don't support everything in did PLC right now, but we'd really be open to adding more of that if people request that, or if they're blocked on us not letting you add certain fields to your did PLC, did doc. Those would be pretty easy to add. The handle system also is not really specific to did PLC. The handles work with did web, dids, or any other did as well. And in theory, the handle system is not really specific to app proto. There's 1 or 2 little details that like say app proto and how we implemented the handles, but we could, I think we'd be open to potentially changing that, or you could have multiple handles for each protocol, or if people want to just like build on top of the app proto handle and use it for other stuff, I think we'd be totally fine with that. So in theory, the handle stuff is generic, both to the specific did method and to app proto. Though there's like a little caveat of there's some identifiers in there. A thing to know for everyone is all the PLC operations are public, permanently public forever. That's like a big property. So we have to be very careful. And that is true. Even if you delete your did, you have to prove that the did was deleted. And that means you need the full chain of operations getting to the delete event, the tombstone. And that stuff sticks around. So there's you probably don't want to put your phone number in there. You don't want to put PII. You don't want to put, you wouldn't want to put content that you would then later want to delete. So a fair amount of thought needs to go into what content actually ends up in your did document. And for other users who might not be super aware of that property. I mentioned a little bit, like the handles can be effectively free because you can put them on a subdomain. We let people register domains. I know it's a cool way to own your own domain, but you can also, if that cost is too much, you don't have to take that cost. You can just use a subdomain. And as just like a little caveat, it's this cool open protocol and open system where people own their data. Pragmatically, almost everyone's been using these did PLCs through Bluesky. And until roughly this week, you haven't actually had a way to like add extra fields or really seize control back of your PLC identity from the Bluesky servers. But we're rolling out some API endpoints for that. It'll still be the kind of thing that you probably need to be a developer, use a command line tool, and be very careful, because if you mess up your identity in this way, we can't help you or help you recover it. but we are enabling that if people want to do it and go out of their way and take that risk on. So those are just a couple kind of like properties of the identity system. So briefly, like, how's it going? We've been doing this, you know, we've been live for Ryan, do you have a question?
Yes, thanks for the previous point. Like when you said like developers can now potentially via the API change their DIP PLC, like what are your expectations? Do you think this will be a very niche thing, or do you think over time this will be like a more accessible thing that more people will use?
I think it'll be extremely niche right now. We had a need to do it to enable account migration. One of the things in your PLC did document is like which service provider are you using for your app proto hosting. And so to change that, you need to also move control of the identity over to that other server, or at least like delegate partial control over to that other server. And so we can't really do the account migration without adding this. So we need to do it right now. And that's why it's going through. And it also, we're doing it in a way that enables people to get self-control. We expect almost no one to really work with this for now. But over time, I think it'll just kind of emerge, right? I think once there's another system that there's actually some use, someone else, like maybe hundreds of thousands of people would like to edit their PLC because they'd like to add some other service to it, then we're really motivated. Okay, now in the client app, you'll be able to go in and just click a couple buttons and that will update it and things like that. But it's not, right now, building out this large, complex, kind of high stakes user flow with an ambiguous, like we don't have a goal to get to right now. As soon as there's other services that would be appealing, then we'd be motivated to do it, I think.
Cool.
I would actually disagree, and I think that, but maybe this is just wishful thinking in the sense that to me, this is the key point of having portable data and accounts with social and lexicons. You're right. Initially, it'd be a few hackers trying things, but I think it's been amazing to see a lot of creative hackers from the very beginning of Bluesky doing all sorts of things. And I really actually think it's reopening up stuff that's been around for roughly 20 years, like WebFinger and your point about like linking different nonads and everything else like that. I mean, I think the domain name system itself was something from the very, very early days. There was the creative set of folks who were like, master domain name, this is cool, this is interesting. But obviously, the affordances of lifting that up into the top layer is what's really going to have impact for masses of people.
Yeah, I think it'll become clearer if there's kind of struggles, that always like sharpens the point, right? If there's a prominent case where someone was like, someone shitified in the ecosystem and I was able to exit because I had pre-configured my thing, that really tells the narrative and sets it. Hopefully, we're not going to do that.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a comment in the chat. Scarcity of did web, as mentioned, is it's impossible to make did web accounts on Bluesky. I think that's the same point, is that these things have to be opened up before you can do more.
Yeah, I think we allowed people to bring did webs in the past. I think that flow might even be broken right now, which is a little bit embarrassing, but we do intend to want to enable it. It's some of these, and some people really know what they're doing, and we want to enable that, right? I think we probably don't want to promote it because we don't want people to accidentally use did webs and then lose control of their domain, and that means they completely lose control of their app. Like there's just sharp edges.
Right. But if you're McDonald's or Coca-Cola, you probably have more faith in your infrastructure for HTTPS than you do in not losing random key.
Sure. And that's a great, like, we should certainly enable that. My take would be like, it probably doesn't need to be in the client app, like Flow. If you're McDonald's, you probably have like a social media team and they're doing this kind of setup, and they could go through an alternative client registration flow. But yeah, we definitely need to make sure that it's working and that we have tests. This is like a good case where we're like, we probably need full end-to-end integration tests for every every component, including when people implement their own PDS in a different programming language or something like that. This would be a nice thing to test and ensure that it works, that you can sign up with bringing your own DID or migrating DIDs around.
Awesome. Please.
Quote. Okay, so kind of like how's it going in prod? Well, I'll state we have some numbers of servers in here. Everything is way over provisioned right now, and the actual costs of operating this are way lower than what's listed here. So I had some numbers from earlier in January. I don't have the most up-to-date numbers for all these, but we had about 3 million DIDs minted, DID PLC DIDs created then. We only had 5 in use. That's probably because it's not been very easy to bring in DID webs. There's some other issues with DID webs, like we can't update your DID web for you. So if your server changes or something like your handle changes, you need to go update. You need to go do that yourself at the same time. So the flows get a little complicated. We do want to support all that, but it's a lot of extra friction. And then just as a rough number, we had like a couple % of people were using, they'd like brought their own custom domain handle. A lot of those were also subdomains on another domain that people in the community were setting up. These kind of like fun subdomains so you can kind of customize what your handle looked like. And then a number of those were like actually, you know, rodandwiden.senate.gov or newyorktimes.com and things like that. Today we have like I think we're over 5 million unique DID PLC docs as a rough scale. The main database is a handful of gigabytes. It's pretty small. We have it way over provisioned. I would guess we could be doing this whole thing for a couple $100s a month if we needed to be doing it at this point in time, but this will let us grow to hundreds of millions of users. We're doing about 130 API resolution calls per second, which is a lot. Almost all of those are us refreshing our own documents from Bluesky. And then about 12 writes per minute. So those are both account registrations and updates to handles and things like that. And this was just at some point last night. That's how much was coming through. That's not like an overall estimate of volume. So a couple other things about how it's going. We had generally it's gone pretty smoothly. Like we went from a few thousand users to 5 million accounts in the last year. And there hasn't been too much turbulence with this. There's been a couple security issues. There's a couple issues with, mutable signatures. There's a couple issues with how we were generating the PLC. We take a hash and then we truncated it, but that was flexible for a while. There's an exploit around that. That's the one case where we have gone and removed operations from the directory. When we did that, we checked with every single account involved and got their consent from everyone. And then we put the operations in the Git repository so everyone can see them. That's kind of our policy right now. If there's a security exploit or a bad thing around, a poison pill or someone's completely borked the whole system, we might go in and remove those. But even if someone broke their account, our policy would be, we're not going to go in and fix it. We want to keep the directory. We want to keep the credibility of the directory is very important to us. So there's there's this great blog post if you have time. Someone from our community, Retroid, had a hack. And so he has this really nice walkthrough of how that works. We made a couple other tweaks to be more compliant with the DID spec and stuff like that. But in general, like in the last 5 months, there's been like a couple commits to the repository. It's been very low effort for us to operate. And we've had very few incidents with the central directory. So that's just to give a picture of like, the system's pretty stable. It's not, it hasn't been like super audited 5 ways by 5 different security companies or anything like that, but it's pretty boring from our perspective right now. Cool. Okay, so that's kind of like where we're at today. And then the question is, how do we get what's stopping other people from using this and building on top of it? And gosh, the whole thing's pretty centralized. There's this central, the lower level, the core spec is pretty cool and self-certifying, but there's this central directory, like that's not very DWeb. It's not very decentralized. And so we think through it, like what are actually from a security standpoint, what are the problems? Like what could the central directory be doing that would not be in the interest of individual account holders? So there's a couple kind of attacks the central directory could do. And this is mostly just to enumerate kind of how limited these are, right? Like central directory can't create new operations because it doesn't have the rotation keys. There's no keys. If you hack the central directory, you don't get it. There's no extra information or context in the directory. So the things you could do is you could just completely remove a did and block it permanently. You would let no new operations come in. So that would basically completely remove an actor from the entire proto network and any other protocols built on top of them. So that's one thing you could do. You could selectively redact ops. So people might have, set up and added, changed keys, rotated keys, moved servers, changed their handle. You could remove a couple of those selectively and basically roll back the identity. And especially if there'd been a dispute and kind of a fork in the identity, you could mess around and force the identity down a different path. So that would be going back and deleting. That would be observable. Other people would see that you'd messed around, but it would potentially have impact. You could selectively prevent new updates. So you could freeze an account, not remove it or remove any existing things, but you could refuse to allow new updates. And in particular, you could even just delay things to mess around with the dispute resolution process. I'm not going to get into the fine details, but it's just like the general category of what you can do is reject new operations coming in. And you can manipulate timestamps. So something that the central directory does, and part of almost everything is self-certified and signed, but the timestamps are not. The central directory adds timestamps, and some of the dispute resolution logic depends on time windows and how long it's been since a previous operation. And the timestamp metadata is actually pretty helpful. If you want to see when an account was registered or an identity was created, you can go back and look at the timestamps from the central directory, and that's just, you're totally trusting the directory when you look at those timestamps. Of course, there's other things. These are just like these kind of security-minded, like what could go wrong in this one particular technical way. The bigger issue are things like, what if Bluesky just goes out of business and doesn't run the server? Like, what's the plan there? Or what if we change the rate limits? That was one thing I didn't mention. We added some rate limits. So there's kind of rules about how often you can update your identity and how large your did document can become and stuff like that. We think those are all pretty reasonable, and we can iterate on them if it's not working for someone's use case. But if we really clamp down on the rate limits or something, or we're not letting someone was growing to hundreds of millions of users and we weren't providing resources to enable that could be a problem for other people. So we've done a couple things to mitigate this already in small ways. So there's an API where you can get there's an endpoint where you can just fetch and enumerate through all of the individual operations in the whole directory. And you can just keep polling on that and keep getting the new things, the new ops as they come in. And we've done a couple dumps from that endpoint to just enumerate everything, make a big tarball, upload it to the Internet Archive. So that's kind of like a disaster recovery. If that one server gets hit by an asteroid, do we lose everything? Well, you'd lose the last couple of weeks and you'd have to go grab this thing. But there's a little bit of a it's at least possible for someone to recreate the entire directory and move over to a new one if it came to that. But it would not be very pleasant, and it's not clear who that would be. Like, who would do this? What would their motivation for doing that be? So that's kind of the status quo. And now I'm going to run through a bunch of little ideas for parts of how to try to make the directory more trustworthy. Some of these are technical. Some of them are really just social. A lot of them kind of presume like, oh, maybe we would create a working group or consortium or get a bunch of companies. We'd have these stakeholders. I'm not going really into the details. There's a lot of different legal structures. This could be a trade group. It could be a nonprofit. It could be a member-based thing where you pay to be a member. It could be a volunteer-based thing where you participate in labor or something like that. Though that's all pretty open-ended, and there's a lot of interesting historical examples to look into there. I'm just going to presume like maybe people would organize and be incentivized to work on this together. So the simple one is just basically keep the existing technical structure and just have one central directory, but move it out of Bluesky. Don't have Bluesky be the organization that's controlling this. We could create a new nonprofit or a small company, or get a little consortium going, like a little trade group, something like the Linux Foundation, have it set up some servers, and that would just, everyone would trust them more. Maybe we would get some really cool board members who've been around a long time that are values aligned. with everyone in the system. Maybe we'd get a bunch of kind of a consortium of other companies and nonprofit organizations, and each of them would get a board seat or something like that. But the basic idea being, don't really change much about how we're operating technically, just get more reputable social folks on board and maybe come up with a more, it could either come up with some kind of business model, or the costs are potentially low enough here that we don't really need too much of we can kind of hand wave the financial stability. That's like a red flag for everyone, or having worked in nonprofits in the past, you're usually like, that's the problem right there. I do feel, having worked at nonprofits in the past, that this one thing is likely to be low cost and low maintenance going forward. That something like the model of the what's called the Internet Security Research Group, which is the nonprofit that maintains the Let's Encrypt SSL certificate system. So Let's Encrypt is free. A lot of the internet now depends on it. It's this crucial thing. And they don't really have a business model, right? They're not charging per certificate. They're not getting revenue. You don't have to be a member. There's no real advantage of being a supporter of Let's Encrypt. It's just this kind of post-scarcity thing where Google is like, yeah, sure, we'll give you $1 million a year. This is just, it's so helpful that, and the costs are so low that people will just donate in and it'll work out. I think in the long term, optimistically, PLC could be there. That's not where it is right now, right? If billions of people are using it for identity and the value to society was so high, I would suspect it could get grants and people would just donate in, and that might be enough to have $1 million or $2 million a year of expenses, but that would be a ways off. Regardless, pretty likely we're probably going to go in a direction like this, at least as some stepping stone, or we just are likely to move control and ownership and responsibility for the PLC system outside of Bluesky, the company, relatively soon. We don't have like an announcement about that or a final decision, but that's pretty good path to take. So a purely technical component of a solution, not a full solution on its own, is to turn the audit log, which right now is just an HTTP fetch endpoint, into something more like certificate transparency. So it'd be some kind of chain or Merkle tree thing where you get it's signed, the directory would have a signing key, and subscribers would see the file history and would be able to detect tampering. We'd probably also switch to a WebSocket so you can get a live, low latency stream of all the events, and this will help with some of the other options mentioned later. On its own, certificate transparency is a bit of a mixed lesson. The concept is that you would have a bunch of observers. So you'd have a bunch of people constantly subscribing to the log and auditing everything and checking. And as soon as there's a problem, a timestamp seems unrealistic, or you dropped something, or you did the resolution logic wrong, they'd have to raise a red flag and go to all the other observers and say like, hey, what do you think? Did you agree? Did the central directory do something non-compliant? And then what? Right? It doesn't resolve all these answers. And the incentives for people to be observers aren't totally clear, right? If you're paranoid, maybe you'd do it. But at best, you never want to don't ever bet against people who just want to be right on the internet. So maybe the sheer desire to be right and catch someone doing something wrong would be enough. But really, it's a fair amount of cost, and it doesn't help you operationally. It just increases trust in the system.
I think one of those things exactly, we're sort of, if you just paint in individuals, just like even the very stark, like 1.5% custom domain handles, then you're like, okay, like that's not going to happen. But if you start painting in other larger orgs who are running their own account systems in the millions, that's an org that itself would want to support the legitimacy of the system.
Yep. And I'll get to, I think some of the other things that compose on top of this would actually align better with the incentives of such an org, right? There's other things those orgs want. This addresses a couple of those threat models. It addresses the removing of a DID or the redaction of things, and probably addresses the timestamps, as long as people are consuming from the audit log fast enough that they can see something going weird with the timestamps. It doesn't solve the refusing service. It doesn't help with operations not being accepted. Maybe that's good enough. And we're likely to do this. This is like probably not going to be a heavy lift. It will compose into some of the other options, but it's probably not like sufficient on its own, right? Like as its own independent thing. Another one that we've bantered around or other people have mentioned is like we could make the whole thing a permission closed blockchain. There's a bunch of these kind of off-the-shelf technologies. I think IBM has a pretty popular one. These are not proof of work. They rely on an enumerated fixed set of parties that all are trusted to be a member of it, but then they're kind of like checking each other. It's not maybe super dissimilar from the certificate transparency thing. But the idea with this is like anyone would be able to write into the log, anyone would be able to read out, and this is maybe aligns a little better with incentives, right? If you'd be a real member and you'd have a real stake and you'd be participating. Regardless, we're not really like we're not pursuing this very actively right now. It's like it would be a whole other bunch of tech, and we would basically need to bootstrap it we'd need a bunch of companies willing to jump in, or other organizations that could be nonprofits as well from the beginning. To do it, and we need probably some kind of legal consortia to get it going. So it's still on the table, but it's not something we're looking at super closely right now. Another component, another kind of like design thing we could do is we could have read replicas. So right now there's just this one global service. It's in the cloud, but it's in the United States. If you're in Japan, the latency isn't super great. We could develop some free software. This wouldn't be too big of a lift. That is consumes from either the existing audit log or this kind of certificate transparency log kind of thing, and basically maintains a full read replica of the whole directory. You wouldn't be able to do writes initially on this. You would just have it, but all your clients could choose. Let's imagine there's 5 or 6 of these run by different companies. Companies are really incentivized to run these. Bluesky would probably run one of these because we can run it in our own data center, and the latency would be lower, and we would have control over the uptime and reliability of it, and that would be nice. And we could be hitting it, tens of thousands of times per second or something like that. And so there's like, we'd potentially, maybe we'd even save money by doing it, even though it's extra effort to run it. It would be worth it to operate one of these just in your own self-interest. Also, if you're running one, maybe you might as well contribute to a public pool, make it a public read API, and then you could have a precedent here is like the NTP time pools, or like the Debian package and Debian and Ubuntu package repositories, which are these pool systems that multiple people contribute to, multiple institutions like universities and other people contribute to. And you do some kind of GeoDNS or Anycast or things like that, and your requests get routed around to a local one. The client would have choice. They could read from whichever replica they want, or there'd be one of these public pool DNS addresses. If they don't care, they can just use kind of the default. This solves a couple issues. It also helps with the reliability and uptime of the whole system. It helps with the scaling. The central directory doesn't need to be as beefy if it's not getting tens of thousands of requests per second. That can all be kind of scaled out, and it can just handle writes. And also, as a disaster recovery thing, if an asteroid hits the central one, in theory, with coordination, one of these could be promoted, or people could keep operating with one of these read replicas. It would be like a live backup of the whole system. Also, these could also be auditing. Like, you already have this service that's a read replica. You might as well implement it in a way it's constantly auditing all the stuff coming down the pipe. And so it solves a number of the kind of like threat model issues and a number of the social issues. It's pretty low coordination, right? Like, we could just put the software out there, let people start working with it, potentially set up the kind of pool thing. But like, do you need to sign a contract to partake in this? A little unclear. There's also some downsides, like maybe any one of these individual read replicas could start removing content or messing with it. And clients it would be a little more burden on the client to decide which one they trust. So it's a bit of a mixed thing, but it's an interesting component. I think this is probably pretty likely, even just from our own self-interest, that we will build something like this at some point.
There's no API to pull anything back. You're not going to mess with the past. You can now use a very cheap audit rule that's like, I will only accept deltas that have a higher timestamp than the highest delta I've ever seen.
Sure, you can start with a very simple.
Like, that's cheap.
Another thing we could do on top of that is we could have write proxies. So when you're doing a write, right now, any client or organization or whoever, if they try, this is just as address that one problem of the central directory denying service to particular operations. Right now, that interaction is over HTTPS, so it's over SSL. It's a private interaction, and it's only observed by those two parties. So if someone's like, hey, I'm trying to update and the central directory is refusing me service and they complain about it, everyone just kind of has to take them at their word. Like they could themselves try to submit the same operation, but it's a bit, one person said, the other person said. One thing we could do to resolve that is we could have writes go through proxies. So your writes would be routed maybe to one of these read replicas or some other kind of service, and then that would forward the request on to the central directory. Then you have this third party who can observe the whole thing. If you make the SSL connection there, and then they make their own SSL connection on, if there's shenanigans, they can log that. And if you had multiple of these in a pool, then if you're having trouble, you can try to fan your request out to multiple proxies and have them all try, and you'd have a paper trail from all of these. It's a bit of a like galaxy brain kind of idea. Like, what's the incentive for doing this? Or in particular, maybe it's very easy to operate one of these, but like you really want to get into the drama. Like, what are people's incentives to participate in this way? So this one's kind of like a maybe. And having another party in the mix also, like privacy of tracking and timestamps and everything, you've now distributed to other people.
You just move the trust around.
Yeah, it gives people more. It's true. This also, it lets clients, and you'd still be able to probably push the writes to the central server directory. The other thing is you could have a variant of this where the central directory doesn't allow writes or even reads from anyone who's not in a consortium, and then that would distribute the costs, and things like the DDoS protection would be spread around to all of the people running these replica nodes. That's like a more long-term kind of potential thing. A last one to mention, like an idea we've bounced around. So this is like, we're not really committed to this, but it's a cool idea. Another cool idea is to do something kind of like a DHT, where you'd have an explicit consortium with explicit members who are committed to run directory services. Each directory would have a full copy and serve read requests for any DID in the whole directory, but only responsibility for writes would be delegated using some kind of ring sharding thing, like a DHT. And you'd say, okay, any DID starting with this, or the hash starting with this, writes to those DIDs have to go to this one particular node. And if a write came into the wrong node, that node would know the state of which writers are responsible for what and would forward them along. This kind of like sets some incentives in a nice way. It shares the cost of running everything. It makes it very clear that like your participation in that ring is important, and that you have power and kind of like both responsibilities and benefits kind of from having some control over it. So it's appealing, socially it's appealing in certain ways. But there's a little bit of, there's a fair amount of extra complexity, like the permission blockchain thing. You kind of need to bootstrap. It's not really meaningful to do this unless you can get like at least 3 or 4 independent parties to sign up at the same time, and they're all pretty reliable. So it's an idea that we're bouncing around, but that's where it is right now. So those are some of the ideas we're thinking about. Some of them, some of those we're likely to move ahead on and are pretty simple as components. None of them like completely solves all the problems, but we can address some of the concerns. If denial of service becomes like a more urgent concern, we could move ahead with the write proxies or something like that. If it's the removal of DIDs that's giving people anxiety and concerns, then we can move ahead with the read replicas and observer kind of model. So there's a little bit of flexibility there. I'll just mention a couple other things that could help, would entice people to use this system. So just more docs and demos and examples, like just showing people using, like, here's how you would actually go about like using a YubiKey key to add that as one of your rotation keys, or here's how you would go about putting your SSH key. If you wanted that, it'll be public forever, but you could put your SSH public key in your DID document and use that in other ways. Some more client libraries for other programming languages. Pretty much everything's in TypeScript and a little bit of Go right now. Some more sophistication about recovery rotation key management. So like a YubiKey or other, maybe your device keys or secure enclaves, that's a little undeveloped how to do these. Maybe a social thing with Shamir key sharing, stuff like that. There's probably just experimentation to be done there. And then more components of this could be formally standardized that might increase people's trust in that. The PLC method has been registered with the W3C, which is an extremely low barrier to overcome. It doesn't really mean that much. We're just in the registry, but it demonstrates that we'd like other people to use it. We could standardize the PLC method through the W3C. I think there's a path to doing that. That would probably be a while. Most of the DID methods have not gone through that kind of standards process, and it's not clear to me whether that would have a lot of benefit compared to some of the other protocol work we're doing. The handle system could potentially fall under IETF. There's some interest in identity stuff there. Anyways, there's some more things we could do there. And then lastly, Boris, there is how we could standardize or clarify some more around how do you do login with these things? How do you do authentication? How do you do authorization? How do you build really pragmatically, how do you start using this system to do stuff? So we put out a proposed spec on how to do OAuth in AppProto, and that is it's generic to any AppProto instance or operator or anyone working the AppProto system, but it requires the account to have a AppProto PDS for that to work, right? There needs to be this other server that you're going to talk to do that OAuth stuff. And that proposal is about how do you delegate control over the AppProto repo? How do you do AppProto stuff? It's not really how do I just go log into some other thing. You could probably eventually, you could probably bend that and use it if you just want to log in as AppProto. That specific term, login with AppProto, could be interpreted a bunch of different ways. I think I rephrased it here a little bit because I think the real generic thing would be login with handle, right? You don't have an AppProto account. You really want to log in with your handle and having a DID document. What does that look like? We don't have an immediate plan forward on how that would work, but we think it would be really darn cool and a kind of obvious thing to do with this whole system. And we'd be really excited to talk to people about working the details out of that. So that was a whole lot.
with a short argument on wall clock time and other things in the chat. The login with handle, that was great. Thank you so much. I know it's a lot to get through because there's a lot of moving pieces here. So I really appreciate you guys putting this all together. I think all of this stuff has become a lot clearer when there are other PDSs in the wild, when other people are federating. All of these tensions start coming in a little bit, and I think there's it also showcases exactly that. To me, it feels very pre-OAuth Twitter. So my recognition of that basically makes me go, okay, log in with handle broadly is a pattern that happened not just for Bluesky clients, but more generally as developers are putting systems together. They're like, oh, I don't want to run my own account system, my own handle system. That's a lot to take on. Wouldn't it be amazing if, right? So where do you see, or any other guidance on so this is the PLC track with a bunch of other things. Where in your track do you see the first non-Bluesky PDSs being turned on?
The first non-Bluesky PDSs, federating and people running them, I don't know, in days.
Very, very soon.
Yeah, very, very soon. How many people will be on? So, I mean, the big there's that question and enabling that. And we publicly said we're doing it this month, and it's getting to the end of the month, so soon.
You got an extra day this year.
Sorry,
it would be amazing if you did it on Leap Day.
We have an extra day to get to it, I guess. Push things back. Realistically, 99.9% of people are going to continue to probably be on the Bluesky server for a fair amount of time, though, right? So it's so then there's the question of when do the alternative either individually, when the number 2 organization server gets large, or just the sum, it could be quite a long time. I don't know, certainly many, many months.
Yeah, for sure. No, I mean, I don't think that was more of a question of the like the possibility there.
Yeah.
A blue sky sized social system does not spring up overnight.
Yeah.
You know, the technology is almost the easy part.
Yeah.
Other questions from the audience? No questions. Login with handle would be great. Does this mean a strict interaction with UCAN? Says Stephen.
We're not, we've thought about that, and we're pretty interested in it. And there's definitely like potentially a place for UCANs in App Proto. Right now we have, so UCANs are a form of bearer token used for authorization in a bunch of, in the distributed fashion. They're kind of cool. They kind of like combine some of the ideas of like macaroons and JWTs, but have a bunch of extra capabilities. We're not, what we have right now in App Proto, so the in App Proto, the OAuth flow, right, is gonna give some opaque bearer token back that you'll use. And a thing that we have right now, so those could someday become UCANs potentially. Right now, what we have is we use JWTs more simply, and sign bearer tokens that can be reused as a session token, so they can be used multiple times potentially, or some of them can only be used once for a short expiration. So that's very UCAN shaped, and there's some things we could do with it, and it would be neat to do. It would definitely be neat and an obvious thing to do, have a like UCAN for App Proto kind of spec and recommendations around that. We're not planning, we don't have any like direct plan to do that like in the coming months. But yeah, there's some things we do. A cool thing in the context of PLC and this whole identity system is that you could do things with UCANs or potentially JWTs that don't have much of a flow, right? Like you can just take someone's DID document, which has a signing key, an App Proto specific signing key in it, and UCAN, and you can validate them. You don't have to talk to any server or do other stuff. And that would be true for other protocols as well, right? If you're doing for certain other protocols, you maybe don't need a server. App Proto is very, based around you kind of delegating a lot of behaviors to a server that acts on your behalf, your personal data server, your PDS. And so that enables things like OAuth, where you need to do this flow where you end up talking to a server, but other protocols maybe don't have that. If they're completely offline or device-centric or really peer-to-peer, there might not be a server to mediate things, but things like UCANs would still work.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's only so much of this we can do ahead of time, and then the rest of it is gonna. I think one of the patterns that we need to break out of, and this is tough, is understanding that Bluesky has priorities. The protocols are open. The code is open. If someone else would like to do things, you guys are open to collaborating and working on specs and other things like that. But you're not going to take on a bunch of work if it's not something that you're going to use, right? The OAuth stuff, I think, is really interesting because it's the like pattern of what people expect today. I wonder for you guys, what does that look like for more like, are you guys going to end up implementing sort of like API keys or something?
It's a good question. I think some of that we're also just going to defer and call it implementation specific. Like we almost certainly are going to need some kind of API token for things like bots. And we have this concept of like app passwords right now. And there's a question of like, okay, now we're going to cut out, there's going to be some transition period. We're not going to pull the rug all at once, but we're going to try to get everyone, all the SDKs and all the third-party clients and everything over onto the OAuth flow. And then we can at least remove the, most people shouldn't be using the old session key stuff, but like we probably need to keep it around in there, some of that around or some form of that around as kind of an escape hatch for like headless devices or offline devices or other, bots running in a cron job where you don't have a flow where you can open a web browser and do the OAuth flow as part of it. But we might to some, there's a balance here. Like, how much do we want to specify and kind of have be part of the spec and say, like, you have to implement this? Like, does every PDS implementation have to implement that API token stuff? And do they have to do it the way we say, or will we just say, like, this is a thing, PDSs can decide what they want to do. This is really about a client, authenticating to the PDS. It doesn't really impact anyone else in the ecosystem or the network. So maybe we can leave that open-ended. On the other hand, it's nice to be able to write bots that work in a consistent way, and there's consistent documentation, and it'll work with any PDS or any service provider. So that's some pressure to actually add it to the spec.
Exactly. I think it points all to the same sorts of things. It's like, let's see what happens 10 days from now.
We really focus, like, there's certain things that are very important for interoperability, right? Like, and interoperability is an important property to have that other people can substitute and exit and migrate around. And there's other stuff where that pressure just like isn't really there. And so, achieving interoperability, it takes effort. It's like work to do, and it's consensus work in the long term to like take this stuff to a standards body or get other people, figure out the governance structure for the future of those things. There's some friction to that. And so if we can scope where we're doing that, it's helpful. I think a bunch of the stuff, a lot of what we're doing is in scope for that.
I got one more question, but I'm going to poll again. Does anyone else have questions for Bryan? And thanks, Daniel, for answering lots of things in the chat.
Do you currently consider it good or poor practice if someone is adding other services to the services section of the doc?
I'd say it's good. I mean, don't stuff like a megabyte of services in there.
I mean, you've already got one spammer that's put a bunch of stuff in the log.
Yeah, it's true. I would say in general, it's not a bad product. If someone's experimenting and doing it, that's fine. Our libraries should be robust too. I think there's some like being really careful around, will everyone respect that and not shred it? Like if you change your PDS location, will every PDS implementation be careful to only change the PDS entry?
Right.
I'd be a little worried about that, but I don't think that's any strong reason not to. And we should probably just specify that you need to be more careful when doing updates on behalf of someone.
Yeah. Question for you, since you brought it up, this IETF W3C. Can maybe talk a little bit more about how you're thinking about IETF as a potential standards home?
Yeah, I mean, we think it's a relatively good for the identity stuff in particular, or just in general. They're great. We like the IETF. We use a lot of IETF standards. A lot of the technology we use is standardized by the IETF. There's kind of a balance, right? Some stuff goes to W3C, some stuff goes to IETF. The two organizations totally collaborate. They have formal liaisons, and a common thing is deciding which should go where, when. I think identity stuff is feels a little sticky to me. Like it's not as totally clear where identity stuff ends up. OAuth obviously is a IETF thing. DIDs are a W3C thing. Things like DNS handles, that's DNS, that's kind of an IETF thing. We're doing a little bit of collaboration around best practices for DNS integrations. Like I think it's called like the responsible DNS integration best practice that'll be coming out in a few months around how to do the DNS lookups and how to cache information and have lifetimes and things like that around the handle integration. So that's already a little bit of a foot in the door there. Rumor is that there's increased interest in IETF around identity and authorization stuff as maybe having like a new work group around that. I don't think we're going to like push super hard in that direction, but we'd certainly be happy to collaborate. Some of the stuff we've done in our OAuth proposal, I will really not be surprised if some of that ends up in the OAuth working group and potentially becomes more standardized in a more generic and general way. So it's a little bit this identity stuff is a little amorphous, and we're not, we can move it. There's also the DIF, the Decentralized Identity Foundation, that's also heavily involved in DID work, and we could put some stuff over there as well.
The way that I always think about it is that for me, the IETF and the scope of what is being done, obviously this is a layer, speaks to beyond browsers effectively. And I'm very excited about that because I think there's a lot of beyond browsers types of things where you have handles, you have streaming structured data, people can have their own data stores for it. Like that's a pretty generic pattern in a good way. And so to me, the IETF like kind of is like, oh yeah, there's this other space that isn't just going to be very strictly concerned with HTTP and browsers. Does that match with how you think about it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think like anything, like stuff that really gets into networking tends to be, WebSocket and HTTP are IETF standards, not W3C standards, kind of weirdly, right? HTML and the JavaScript APIs and stuff like that very clearly over on the W3C side. And so stuff that's like really right in the middle gets a little weird. But, for most of App Proto, like the repository data structure, it's a data structure using cryptographic hashes and blobs. That's not something that the W3C would never touch. It's like not totally out of scope, but CBOR is a IETF standard, and that's probably where we'll move a bunch of that.
Awesome. One more call for questions.
I guess really briefly, I should say, like,
please.
we don't get to choose, right? The IETF is a process. Like, we can't just like roll in and be
Yes,
like,
yes.
now we're doing this, right? We have to go with people are interested in being part of that process. Really enthusiastic about that. Like, we think we've talked to a lot of people, and we think it will be the work we're doing will hopefully be well perceived. But it's a long consensus process, not just like stand up or anything like that.
Rudy has a question about why DAG CBOR.
There's like some social connection there where some of the people working in the early days on Bluesky had connections to IPFS, and a lot of us were like familiar with IPFS previously, and DAG CBOR is an IPFS thing. In general, it's just kind of pragmatic. We're the CBOR standard, like there's a lot, the whole question of like, how do you represent data as CBOR and as JSON and flip between the two is a kind of underspecified thing. And DAG CBOR is like, let's take a smaller subset of that and specify how it's going to work and try to avoid some of the sharp edges, or at least call out those sharp edges around things like floats or integer size and like sorting keys and maps. And there's all these like little nitty gritty details. Certainly we wanted to avoid, like, big respect for all the peeps doing the work to make it happen, but like trying to come up with a canonical encoding of JSON, I think is just like very painful. So there's all this cool Jose stuff and all that. And it's like, that's all good. And they're like doing good work, but like, if we could just not do that, we'd be very happy. CBOR is like much more amenable to a deterministic encoding. Even within CBOR, there's like 3 or 4 different flavors floating around. There's some IETF work right now around deterministic CBOR and how that fits in with other existing attempts at doing deterministic CBOR. So it's not a totally clean picture, but it's a lot more tractable.
Amazing. Well, I'm going to call it there. We're over time. Big round of applause for Bryan. Thank you so much. That was awesome. I am gonna say that the IETF is meeting in Vancouver in July. I think, Bryan, you're going to be in town.
I'll be there. Yeah.
And I'm going to help run a series of events around that might be bigger, generally, not just Bluesky related. So put end of July in your calendars if you want to go deep on this stuff. Thank you very much.